those old car ads,
Yeah.
you know, the ones from like the 60s, all that gleaming chrome and those tail fins and that open road, it just screamed freedom, right? But what they didn't show you were the accidents.
Nah.
Back then, fatal car crashes were like 5 times more common than they are now.
Wow.
It's crazy to think about, but like someone you knew probably died in a car accident back then.
Yeah, it's a grim statistic for sure.
It is. So today we're going to dive into the world of consumer activism and the guy who pretty much single-handedly forced the auto industry and like the whole country to deal with this whole consumer safety thing.
You're talking about Ralph Nader, of course.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting about him is that his whole story starts with the simple question, like, are drivers always the ones to blame when there's a crash? Or could the car itself be part of the problem?
Yeah, I bet a lot of people were wondering that back then, especially with how dangerous cars were back then.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So what was it about Nader that led him actually like push this issue into the spotlight?
Well, he had this really unique mix of personal experience, a sharp legal mind, and this incredible drive to uncover the truth. So Nader grew up in Connecticut, and even as a kid, he was always questioning things, looking for evidence, not just accepting what he was told.
Kind of like a natural-born skeptic.
Yeah, exactly. And there's this great story about his dad who owned a restaurant, you know, asking young Ralph, did you learn how to believe or did you learn how to think?
Wow.
And that kind of critical thinking, it really defined his whole life.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
So it sounds like that questioning spirit, that need to really figure things out, is what led him to investigate the auto industry. What did he find when he started looking into car safety?
What he found was actually pretty shocking. So through his research, he went through crash documents, accident reports, even studies that were funded by the industry itself.
Wow, he really dug deep.
Oh, yeah, he did. And what he uncovered was evidence that car manufacturers knew about some serious safety defects, but chose to prioritize profits over people's lives.
You mean they knew they were selling dangerous cars?
It's worse than that. They weren't just ignoring safety, they were actively trying to hide information and fighting against regulations.
It's hard to believe that companies would knowingly put people at risk like that.
I know, it's pretty shocking.
So what happened when he started going public with all of this?
At first, he was mostly ignored.
Really?
Yeah, but then in 1965, he published this book called Unsafe at Any Speed, and that book was a bombshell.
I heard that.
It exposed the truth about how little the auto industry cared about safety, and it really resonated with people. They started to realize that they were being taken advantage of.
I bet they were outraged.
Oh, yeah, they were.
But Unsafe at Any Speed wasn't just a critique of the auto industry in general. It really focused on one car in particular, the Chevrolet Corvair. Why was that car so dangerous?
Well, the Corvair, with its rear-engine design, had this tendency to become unstable at high speeds and was prone to rollovers.
Ah, I see.
Nader documented all these flaws in detail and called out General Motors, the manufacturer, for knowingly selling a car they knew was unsafe.
So what did GM do?
Instead of addressing the safety concerns, they decided to go after Nader personally.
Seriously?
Yeah, they tried to discredit him, dug into his personal life, even hired private investigators to try and catch him doing something wrong.
It seems like a pretty extreme reaction.
It was like a classic David versus Goliath story.
Yeah.
This young, idealistic lawyer taking on one of the most powerful corporations in the world.
And what happened? Did they manage to silence him?
Nope. Their attempt to silence him totally backfired.
How so?
The Senate decided to hold hearings to investigate GM's tactics, and it turned into a complete disaster for them. Their dirty laundry was aired for everyone to see, and instead of being discredited, Nader was suddenly a national hero.
Wow, what a turnaround.
Yeah, it was a huge moment. It showed that even giant corporations could be held accountable and that public outcry could actually make a difference.
This must have been a turning point for Nader and for the consumer movement as a whole, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
This is where things really start to get interesting.
Okay, so we've talked about Nader's early life, his investigation into the auto industry, and that incredible showdown with GM.
Right.
What happened next? How did this one man's crusade turn into a nationwide movement?
Well, that's what we're going to dive into next.
I can't wait. Stay with us, folks. It was a turning point for sure. Suddenly, this whole idea of like consumer rights was on everyone's radar. So what did Nader do with all this newfound fame and influence?
He didn't just sit back and relax, you know. He knew this was just the start.
Yeah.
I mean, car safety was a huge victory, but there were so many other areas where consumers were being exploited or put in danger.
So he went from this lone wolf taking on GM to leading a whole army for consumer rights. It's got to be a big jump. How'd he do it?
He was really good at getting people fired up, especially young people.
Mm.
So he created this network. It became known as Nader's Raiders.
I've heard of them.
Yeah, a bunch of idealistic, mostly young lawyers and activists going out investigating corporations and government agencies.
Ida's Raiders, it sounds like a movie.
It kind of does, doesn't it? And remember, this is the late 60s, early 70s, a time when people were starting to distrust institutions more and more.
Makes sense.
People were ready for someone to challenge the way things were, and Nader gave them the tools and the platform to do it.
So these raiders, 1,000 people strong, taking on everything from unsafe baby food to pollution. It's a pretty wide range. They actually make a difference.
Oh, a huge difference.
Really?
They were instrumental in pushing for some of the most important consumer protection laws we have today.
Like what?
Well, think about the Clean Air Act that sets standards for air quality and limited pollution from factories and cars.
Right.
Or the Clean Water Act protecting rivers and lakes.
Okay, yeah.
And maybe the biggest one, the creation of OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration.
Yeah, OSHA.
Before OSHA, workplaces could be incredibly dangerous with almost no protection for workers at all.
It's crazy how much we take those things for granted now. Clean air, clean water, safe workplaces. It really shows just how much impact Nader and his raiders had. But all this success, it couldn't have gone unnoticed by the corporations they were targeting. Did they face any pushback?
Oh, yeah. As the consumer movement gained more and more power, there was definitely a backlash. Corporations started fighting back against all these regulations, saying they were too expensive, they were hurting the economy, they were stifling innovation.
So they were saying all this regulation was bad for business.
Exactly. And this message started to resonate with some people, especially as the economy started to struggle in the late 70s.
So what happened? Did this backlash slow down the consumer movement?
It definitely had an impact. Remember, this was a time of high inflation, high unemployment. People were worried about their jobs.
Right.
In that kind of environment, the argument that regulations are bad for business starts to make more sense to people.
It sounds like the stage was set for a showdown between the people fighting for consumer protection and the people pushing for deregulation. So who are some of the key players on this other side?
One of the most influential figures in this countermovement was a lawyer named Lewis Powell.
Powell.
He wrote this memo. It became known as the Powell Memo.
Okay.
It was basically a call to arms for corporations to fight back against what he saw as too much government and an overly powerful consumer movement.
The Powell Memo, I've heard that name, still talked about a lot today when people discuss corporate influence in politics. So what were some of his main arguments?
Powell argued that businesses needed to be way more politically active. He saw the consumer movement as a threat to free enterprise and capitalism itself. He wanted corporations to use their money and influence to change public opinion, lobby politicians, and challenge regulations in court.
So he was basically saying that corporations needed to fight back.
Yeah, he was advocating for a much more aggressive approach from corporations, one that went beyond just focusing on their bottom line.
And did he have any specific ideas for how they could do that?
He laid out a whole plan for corporate political action.
Like,
He urged them to get involved in education funding think tanks that promote free market ideas, even influencing the selection of judges.
wow.
He wanted to create an environment where the consumer movement would be seen as like a radical fringe group, not a legitimate force.
So you have Ralph Nader and his raiders on one side fighting for consumers, holding corporations accountable. And on the other side, you have Lewis Powell and a growing corporate backlash arguing for less regulation and a more hands-off approach from the government. That sounds like a pretty epic battle. So what happened next? Did Nader and the consumer movement keep their momentum going?
This is where things start to shift.
Really?
One of Nader's big goals was to create a federal agency focused entirely on consumer protection.
That makes sense.
He thought that having a powerful agency like that could help balance things out against all those powerful corporate interests.
So what happened? Did he succeed?
This is where he hit a wall. Despite all his efforts, his dream of a consumer protection agency never happened. It got blocked.
You're kidding.
Yeah.
Even with all his fame and influence, he couldn't get a consumer protection agency approved. Why? What happened?
It shows how effective that corporate backlash had become. They were able to use their money and their influence to stop legislation that they saw as a threat. And this shift toward less regulation, it just got stronger with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980.
Right. Reagan was a very pro-business president.
He was. He saw a lot of the consumer protections that had been put in place as government overreach.
So he basically rolled back a lot of the progress that Nader and the consumer movement had made?
Not all of it, but he definitely created a tougher environment for consumer advocates.
So the Reagan era marked a big shift in the balance of power between corporations and consumers. What about Nader? Did he just give up?
He never stopped fighting for consumer rights. He
Yeah.
kept writing, speaking out, organizing, but his influence had definitely diminished.
Yeah.
And then in 2000, he made a decision that would change his legacy forever.
Ah, yes. The 2000 election. That's what a lot of people remember Nader for, even more than his work on consumer issues.
It was a very close election, and his candidacy caused a lot of debate.
So what happened?
Nader, always the one to go his own way, decided to run for president as a third-party candidate.
As in not a Democrat or a Republican.
Right. He said both parties were too controlled by corporate interests and that a third party was needed to actually represent ordinary people.
So he was taking on the whole two-party system.
He was. It was a pretty bold move.
I bet it was. How did people react?
It was a really mixed bag. Some people, especially those who were tired of the two main parties, they were excited about Nader's candidacy. They saw him as a principled alternative, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the powerful.
But I'm guessing not everyone was happy about it.
You're right. A lot of Democrats were furious.
I bet.
They saw him as a spoiler who could take votes away from Al Gore and help George W. Bush win.
And well, that's exactly what happened. The election was incredibly close.
Yeah.
And Nader being on the ballot in some key states like Florida, it probably helped Bush win.
It was a very controversial outcome, and it definitely had a big impact on how people viewed Nader.
Yeah, he went from being a hero to a villain in the eyes of a lot of people.
For sure.
So we've talked about Nader's early life, his battle with the auto industry, the rise of the consumer movement, the backlash it faced, and then his controversial run for president. It's been quite a journey. What does it all mean? What's the lasting impact of Ralph Nader and everything he fought for?
That's a big question and one that's still being debated today.
Okay, so we've covered like a ton about Nader, his early days, his fight with the auto industry, the rise of the consumer movement, the backlash against it, and then his wild run for president. What does it all mean? What's his legacy? What about the movement he helped create?
It's complicated, that's for sure. I mean, on one hand, you can't deny the impact he had, like all those safety features we have in our cars now, seat belts, airbags, those crumple zones.
Yeah.
Those came from the pressure that Nader and the consumer movement put on the auto industry. And it's not just car safety, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, OSHA.
Yeah.
Those laws have made a huge difference for millions of Americans.
It's amazing how much things have changed since the 60s. Like back then, consumers had basically no rights, no way to fight back when they were sold dangerous products or whatever.
Yeah, they were at the mercy of the companies.
Right. So Nader really helped to shift that balance of power, didn't he?
Absolutely. He made it okay to question authority, to expect more from corporations, to expect the things we buy to be safe and our workplaces to be protected. He helped people see themselves as consumers with rights, not just like passive victims.
Right.
But then there's the other side of it, his run for president and how it affected the 2000 election.
Yeah.
For a lot of people, that one decision kind of overshadowed everything else he did.
I wonder if he regrets it.
He's always defended his decision, saying the two-party system is broken and that third parties are needed to shake things up. He said that neither Democrats nor Republicans truly cared about regular people and that we need another option.
And that's a debate that's still going on today, isn't it?
It is. The role of third parties, the influence of money in politics, whether our leaders actually represent us, these are all issues that Nader brought up, and they're more relevant than ever.
So even though the consumer movement might have peaked back in the 70s, it's not really gone away.
No, it hasn't.
We see it today in how people are more aware of things like data privacy, climate change, corporate power.
Yeah?
People are demanding more accountability, and they're finding new ways to organize and make their voices heard.
The tools might be different, social media, online petitions, consumer groups, but the idea is the same. It's about understanding the power we have as consumers and citizens and using that power to hold the powerful accountable. It's about demanding a system that puts people before profits that's fair, just, and sustainable.
So what does all this mean for us, the consumers of today? What can we learn from Nader's wins and his losses?
I think the big lesson is that we can't just sit back and assume things will be okay. We have to stay informed, be involved, speak up when things are wrong.
It's call to actions, right?
It is. It's about being active in our democracy, being informed consumers, using our voices and our choices to create the world we want to live in.
So it's not just about buying the right products or whatever. It's about being engaged citizens.
Exactly. And it's not just about national stuff. It can start locally with the choices we make every day. Supporting businesses that do the right thing, researching the products we buy, thinking about our impact on the environment. These are all ways we can use our power as consumers to actually make a difference.
So the next time you hear about a product recall or a company doing something shady or you're just fed with how things are, remember Ralph Nader and the consumer movement. Remember that you have a voice, you have power, and you can make a difference.
And who knows, maybe there's another young lawyer out there somewhere inspired by Nader, ready to take on the challenges we face today and fight for a better world.
Yeah, maybe.
And we can all be part of that in our own way. It's up to us to decide what kind of world we want and then go make it happen.
Well said. That wraps up our deep dives into Ralph Nader and the rise and fall of the consumer movement. If you enjoyed this look at consumer activism and how it affects us, be sure to subscribe to the Deep Dive for more explorations of the people and events that have shaped our world. See you next time, folks.